series today called Following Jesus. We'll be in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 6. And we'll talk about a miracle account here where Jesus multiplies the loaves and fish. You may remember this. It appears in all the Gospels, and so they can give us some other details on it. That certainly would have been the big news of the day in this little town called Bethsaida. When you think about what constitutes headline news, we don't really have newspapers so much anymore. The print newspaper is kind of slowly becoming a thing of the past, but I did bring some examples of headlines in newspapers where you just kind of wonder why they would word it that way. Either it's just awkward or, well, for example, federal agents raid gun shop, find weapons. Was this really a big scoop here? How about this? Bridges help people cross rivers. This is the kind of hard-hitting journalism we find in the Battle Creek Inquirer. Starvation can lead to health hazards. I don't know. I'm not a nutrition expert. I don't know. I do think there's something to this. Disappearing husband may be sign of marriage breaking up. He doesn't come home anymore, but things are fine, really. Homicide victims rarely talk to police. Apparently, sometimes they do. This wasn't a headline, I just thought it was odd. Police respond to call on man sniffing glue. He denied it, but when he tried to flick a cigarette from his hand, it stuck to his fingers. What? What are you looking at? Shut up. I don't know. Oh, this just in. City unsure why sewer smells. I have an idea. But, they didn't ask me. Finally, this is so dumb that this is an American artist who made this big inflatable thing, and really, this is why other countries hate us, really. What can you say about that, really? Well, clearly the headline in the north end of the Sea of Galilee back then would have been, man feeds multitude with, very little food, right? This happens at a spot close to Capernaum where Jesus lived. Here's the shoreline on the north end of the Galilee. It's really one of my favorite spots in Israel, and every time I take groups there, I like to take a boat and cross, and we usually stop in the middle of the lake and read some of these passages. And what makes it nice there is the Israeli government doesn't allow anything to be built on the shore. So the city of Tiberias is there on the west side, but for most of this, you see it, how Jesus and his first followers, the disciples, would have seen it. In the background on the left, you can see that valley between two mountains. That's called the Valley of the Doves. That's the road that goes to Magdala and ultimately to Nazareth. So that's the way Jesus would have traveled coming here. You see Magdala on the western coast there. Well, on the north, you see Capernaum, Gennesaret. There are other little villages that aren't listed here, but notice how Bethsaida in the upper right is a little ways back from the shoreline, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That created some questions about the identity of it. Luke gives us the general location here. Luke 9, verse 10, when the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. He took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. That means house of fishing or house of fishermen. Bet or Beth in Hebrew means house, like Bethlehem is house of bread. Bethsaida is house of fishermen. John 1:44 tells us that Philip, Peter, Andrew lived there. Here's the city gate of Bethsaida. Later in Mark's gospel, Jesus leads a man right outside the city gate and heals him right there. That's where the guy opens his eyes and first sees trees. That happened right at this spot. So this is the entrance to Bethsaida. Archaeologists have excavated a large insula-type house, which is Latin for island. It's a term for a courtyard with housing built around it. Like when Jesus says, I go to my Father's house to prepare a place for you, that's because the Father had the house, and as the sons would get married and they'd take the bride back, they'd build around the Father's house. Jesus uses that as a way of coming for the church, the bride of Christ. Here's a little diagram, what that looked like, so you can see the courtyard there, the Father's house on the left. Here's that large courtyard, just made out of field stones here. So all of this goes back to the 1st century. Now, we don't know that any of the disciples lived in this very house. It's possible, but we know it belonged to fishermen because there were net weights and fish hooks and that kind of thing. Well, John adds this detail in John chapter 6, verse 3. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside or a hill. 100-foot hill was called a mountain relative to surrounding areas. We think Mount Everest or something when we hear mountain, but Jesus went up on a hill and sat down with his disciples. So they're in the hill country, somewhere around Bethsaida here. We don't know exactly where they were. You can see some hills in the background. Here's the last time I took a group from our church here, where I'm just reading the passage and we're looking out toward the Galilee. You can see hills in the background there also. And this is where I mentioned that the village is a little ways back from the shoreline, which created some questions about its identity, right? I mean, is this Bethsaida? Do we have the right spot? You can see the mound on the bottom, and toward the top of that in the photo, you can just barely see this little pavilion where we were in that last photo, looking toward the water. Why would you have a fishing village, nearly a mile from the water? Well, as it turns out, because some have theorized maybe there was a river, the Jordan River was nearby that fed into it. But it turns out that all of that land, just in this little corner of the lake, it has receded quite a bit, and the original shoreline was closer to about this spot, based on a level of silt and marine life fossils that they found there. They can determine that, and in fact, did come, like 100 feet from the village, which is up on a hill. It would make more sense to, have your ancient pier and a place for your boats there. So they're on the northern end of the lake here. They started closer to Capernaum, between Capernaum and Gennesaret. We see this in verse 1 in chapter 6. Then in our main passage, we'll start in verse 31 in chapter 6. Because so many people were coming and going, they did not have a chance to eat. He said to them, Jesus, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all those towns, Capernaum and so on, and got there ahead of them. So they started on the other side of the lake. They crossed. They're somewhere in the grassy hills east of Bethsaida. We don't know exactly where they are, but they start running around the north end of the shore from all these little villages because they know Jesus is doing amazing things. They want to hear more of his teaching. All they know is he and the disciples got on a boat, and they can run faster than the guys can row. So they're watching the boat just running to the other side of the lake, not knowing where they're going to stop. This is the exact shoreline. I took this picture between Capernaum and Bethsaida, where they were running along. And here again, because they don't build things there today, they don't permit that, it is kind of interesting to see basically what it would have looked like back then. You can imagine thousands of people are running along the shore just to get another glimpse of Jesus, to hear what he might say. And we see the character of Christ here. Look at verse 34. When Jesus landed, they get out of the boat and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things he wants them to learn. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. This kind of recalls back in the book of Exodus when the Israelites were without food and God provides manna here, this bread-like substance. But in this case, Jesus also wants to teach them something. He knows they need food, but look what he says in verse 37. He answered, "You give them something to eat." It might surprise us to look in the Gospels and see the disciples come to Jesus with a problem, and Jesus says, "You handle it." And there's kind of a little faith lesson in there for us, I think, that sometimes God wants to work through us rather than in place of us. And that's what we see here. Look at their response, verse 37. They said to him, "It would take 8 months of a man's wages, 200 denarii, and that would only buy about 2,400 loaves of bread. Even if you started splitting up these little loaves a bunch of different ways." They say, "Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" So Jesus clearly has some work to do at this point with the mindset of the disciples. So that brings us to the first of our application points, how this applies to us, I think. Look at number 1 in our outline. Jesus wants us to have an attitude of giving. He wants the disciples here to show hospitality, which is essential in ministry. They're not interested in feeding the people, but Jesus clearly is. Now, we don't want to take that too far, as some groups have done, and this becomes exclusively then a social gospel kind of thing. I talked about that last month. There are some groups that say Jesus' whole ministry was just to help the poor. They don't even have any interest in talking about salvation and the forgiveness of sins. Well, the social gospel pushes things too far, but at the same time, clearly Jesus did want people to help the poor and show compassion. That was important to him, so he involves the disciples. Look at verse 38. The closer we are to Jesus, the more he expects us to share in his work of compassion. "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. The fish would have been dried, which is how they processed them then, because you didn't really have a way to store it. So imagine sort of like a beef jerky kind of product, but it's fish basically. It would be dried and salted, and it'd be preserved that way. The loaves, which the Gospel of John tells us were made of barley. Barley was considered the food of the poor. These loaves were about a half-inch thick, maybe less, 7, 8 inches in diameter, something like that. The fish they caught, they still catch these fish today. It's a tropical fish found only in the north end of the lake, and we'll talk about why. Here you see some men, this photo taken just a few years ago, using a trammel net. I talked about that a little bit. It's a couple boats to deploy this when we looked at John 21. And it's basically a species of tilapia, not like the farm-raised kind of fish we're used to. This is a tropical variety that gets quite large. They call it mushed there locally, which And the language means comb because it has this long dorsal fin that is kind of uncharacteristic for a fish, runs the whole length of the body. Now, to imagine what this boy shows up with and what we'll see in the passage, the 2 fish and 5 loaves, probably something like that in a basket, right? So this is all they have to work with. What does Jesus do? Look at verse 39. Then he directed them all to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. That's an interesting detail. Why would he bother to tell us the color of the grass? Well, that it's green grass indicates that it's in the spring, which means the previous fall's harvest has been depleted, which means it's going to be even more difficult to get that much bread this time of the year. Now, I took this photo from Bethsaida at one of these large grassy hills in the summer, so it's not green, but this is an example. In the spring, this would be completely green. I'm usually there in July or August, and it looks a lot different, but there are huge hills like this that are kind of gently sloped that would easily hold thousands of people that we see here. Look at verse 40. Jesus organizing his ministry here for efficiency. Remember in 1 Corinthians 14, God's not a God of disorder. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He handles it in a calm, orderly manner. And that illustrates our second point. Look at number 2. Jesus is not intimidated by the magnitude of our problems. Remember, something may seem huge to us, but it isn't for him. And we know that when we come to these miracle accounts in the Gospels, obviously if somebody's coming to this text and doesn't have any belief in God, or, an atheist looks at this, or an agnostic, well, clearly the miracle stories are going to be a tough sell, obviously, but that just gets back to whether or not there is a God. I've mentioned this before on other issues. If people say, well, I don't think there's a God, then yeah, I understand they'd find this kind of thing hard to believe. What I find kind of odd is when people say, well, I think there's some kind of creator out there, but this multiplying the loaves and fish thing, come on, that's ridiculous. But that's kind of like saying, I believe there's a being that has the power to create the entire universe, but it's absurd to think he would have the power to create bread and fish, which seems like did you see what I mean? It seems like an odd position to hold here. Look at verse 41. Here's where the miracle occurs. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them. Now, it's interesting, we're not told about the specific operation of the miracle. Like, I read something like that, and I wonder, like, what would it look like if you were there? And we're just not told. Like, does Jesus reach in a basket and pull one out, and then just another one appears there? It's kind of like in Charlie Brown when Snoopy's eating like off this big pile of bones. He keeps taking one, but the level actually never goes down. Is it like that, or does he pick up one and then suddenly there's one in each hand? Or we're not told about the mechanics of it, just that this was a miracle. And the Christians here, as soon as Christianity was legal, after Constantine and the Edict of Milan, one of the first Christian churches ever built was right here on the north end of the lake to commemorate this miracle. Byzantine Christians built a church there at a place called Tabga, and this is the original mosaic floor from this church built in the early 300s. Now, those don't look like the fish there because, they're doing this a couple centuries later, but there is an interesting theological motif with the art here, because you look in that basket, there are only 4 loaves. The idea artistically was that Jesus is the 5th because Jesus is the bread of life, right? Which is kind of an interesting symbol here. as I was preparing this, I kind of jotted down some of the skeptical theories that people have put out there, because you come to something like this and people who say, well, there's no God, or I'm not going to believe Jesus or the Bible, whatever, how would you explain this? Well, over the decades, some scholars have said this is a miracle of sharing, that Jesus got really selfish people. Say half the people had food and half didn't. So the miracle was that he got these really selfish people to share. Well, okay. I mean, that's still a nice thing. You know, I don't know that I'd call that a miracle. I mean, if it's little kids with candy, maybe that's a miracle. Or like siblings with toys. Growing up with my brother, I never wanted a toy unless he had it. And then I had to have it. So, okay, maybe that's like a miracle of sharing. The most interesting one, back in the 50s, there was a book that came out suggesting that bestseller for a long time. You look back and you think, man, the lengths that people will go to deny a miracle, really amazing. It was suggested then that Jesus was the leader of a hallucinogenic mushroom cult, and that basically it was one huge LSD trip, and they thought they saw fish and bread multiplied. That's an actual theory that was put out there. Two scholars, Schaefer and Otto, later in 1965, suggested, and this actually had some traction through the 70s, that this was a case of mass hypnosis, that Jesus hypnotized all the thousands of people to believe that they had something to eat and felt full, but they never actually had any food. Well, if you continued to read the passage, I mean, that would also suggest that he hypnotized the apostles to take home the leftover food to their hypnotized families who ate it and also felt full. I mean, at a certain point, I think it takes more faith to believe that than just that Jesus multiplied the food. But again, the lengths people will go to deny a miracle. And look at verse 42. We see the extent of God's provision here. They all ate and were satisfied. Our resources may at times seem inadequate, but that's God's issue to deal with, not our worry. And that brings us to our third point then. Jesus can do incredible things with meager resources. Definitely a way that it applies to us today. And there are two principles, I think, reinforced with this point. So I put a couple little bullet points in our outline. The first is that God will bless our service to him. And that's why Jesus is praying here. In verse 41, he gave thanks. He showed the importance of responding to God with gratitude for his divine blessing. And then that second bullet point under number 3, God multiplies what we give him. And that's not just about money or resources. It's time or whatever we're able to do. Jesus provides in abundance. Look at verse 43. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. That surplus there also speaks to his grace and his power. Now, like we said a moment ago with the social gospel, we don't want to carry this too far and turn it into a prosperity gospel, where Jesus wants every believer, provided that you have sufficient faith, to be incredibly wealthy and in perfect health. This is a false message. It's very popular today, but this doesn't teach a prosperity gospel. Jesus didn't turn the barley loaves, the food of the poor, into the food of the wealthy. I see this misapplied all the time here, but he does meet their needs. And that's our last point then. Look at number 4. Jesus provides for physical and spiritual restoration. And this illustrates then how he can restore us in both realms. And there's a second key here to this, that the provision comes through the disciples. So the 12, as Jesus sends them out, and I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks as we look at Matthew 10 and Matthew 11, they know what they will be able to do through Christ. With that authority, they're empowered like the prophets. Listen to 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 to 44, because the miracle of multiplying loaves of bread like this first occurred in the Old Testament. It happened with Elisha. A man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God, Elisha, 20 loaves of barley bread. Again, that's what John tells us Jesus had to work with here. Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. How will I set this before 100 men, his servant asked. But Elisha answered, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. And now Jesus in the New Testament is operating with that same divine power, but in an even greater way. And the disciples learn then what they can do through Christ who enables them. Look at verse 44. The number of men, by the way, New Testament was originally written in Greek. Aner in Greek means males. Just like with a census, they only counted males. I know this is incredibly sexist, but that was the reality in the first century. So when it says 5,000 people ate, it's 5,000 males. The total number of people, 20, 25,000 maybe, and there would have been women and children there. So it's actually a much larger number. The number of men who had eaten, verse 44, was 5,000. I always kind of jokingly think if Mark had been a pastor in the church growth movement where pastors tend to exaggerate attendance numbers, the actual number would have been more like 3,500 probably. But this is the opposite of pastoral math. So it was 25,000 people maybe. And the disciples then see they can accomplish things that they never dreamed of doing. Only their own doubts will keep them from moving forward. And Jesus has to remind them of that completely, to step out in faith. And while all these people are restored physically in terms of hunger, he also wants to teach them about spiritual restoration. And that happens with another feeding of 4,000 people. And I'll mention just a couple verses on this. In the next chapter, Mark 7, verse 31, it says, Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre, which is where he had gone after the feeding of the 5,000, and went through Sidon. So if you look at the map, he finishes the feeding near Bethsaida, travels way north into what today is Lebanon. Then I put that brown line there. Travels to the region of the Decapolis. You can see that large label on the lower right. In Greek, that means 10 cities, and that's a Gentile area. He was in an exclusively Jewish area, then goes into an absolute non-Jewish area. Remember, that's the place where the pigs go down the hill into the sea. That's also in the Decapolis. You wouldn't have pigs in a Jewish area. That's not a kosher animal. So in Mark chapter 5, right before this, that happens in the Decapolis also. And again, we don't know exactly where they are for the feeding of the 4,000. It's somewhere between Gergesa, or Kursi, it's called today, and Hippos. There's a little village there called En-Gev I always like to go to. And in that general area is where we think this happened. So he went through Sidon, he's heading south, down to the Sea of Galilee, Mark 7:31, and into the region of the Decapolis. Now, some say these are the same feeding. In fact, Haaretz, which is the leading Jerusalem newspaper, it means the land in Hebrew, last summer they discovered the church there where this feeding of the 4,000 took place. And I understand that, especially in Jerusalem, you're not going to have a ton of New Testament scholars. You'd still think they do a little more fact-checking than this, but the headline was, Miracle of the Multiplication Mosaic found on the wrong side of the Galilee, right? They found this on the east side. It should have been on the north side, closer to Bethsaida. Well, it wasn't found on the wrong side. It's a different feeding. It's a different episode. People tend to think that those are the same. Also found mosaics with tiny fish in them. Again, this is a Byzantine church all the way back to the 300s here. How do we know these are different feedings? Well, they're different locations. Even different fish are mentioned in the Gospels. I think that's a fascinating detail. There are different numbers of baskets left over. The church fathers, the ancient church, clearly saw this as the 5,000 and the 4,000 representing Jewish people and non-Jewish people. So how do we come to that conclusion? Well, here's what Mark says on feeding the 4,000 in terms of them being different. In Mark 8:7, they had a few small fish. These are the kind of details that, maybe not everybody gets as excited about this as I do, but these are the kind of details I just think are great, because when Mark talks about the feeding of the 4,000, he uses the Greek word ichthudion. Now, typically the word would be ichthus for just an average-sized fish, regular fish. When they talk about catching those tilapia, the larger fish in the north, with feeding the 5,000, they use the word ichthus. Here in Greek, the same writer, Mark, uses a different term. Ichthudion means tiny fish. And it's not about the size, it's about the species. They're sardines. And they're only found in that part of the lake. In the northern Galilee, I mentioned Tabga. This is where that first mosaic is that we looked at, which is a corruption of Greek heptapagon. It means 7 springs. There are 7 warm water springs that come into the Galilee. So if you're looking to get into the Galilee to swim, the water is much warmer all the way to the north, because that's where all the warm water enters the lake. By the time you get to the south, the southeastern part of the lake, the water is actually quite cold. Those tilapia are tropical fish. They won't go to the cold water. Around Tiberias, there's one hot spring, but still all the warm waters in the north. This is called the Cove of the Parables. This is between Capernaum and Bethsaida. You can see that warm waterfall coming in there. Well, these tropical tilapia eat plankton, so they love this environment. So imagine that part of the lake being warm water, and Mark's description of the fish caught there makes sense with the water temperature. But down here, it's all cold water. So when they catch fish down there, and the sardine industry is still huge there, these are the only fish that like cold water in the lake. So even the species type is correct, which I just think is fascinating. That's a little place we a lot of times will cross over in a boat to En-Gev and have lunch there. But notice that boat on the right with the nets. They're going out to catch ichthudion, the small fish here. Well, all of this to say, with these 2 feedings, they represent 2 different cultural groups of people. And also then, in Mark 8:8, the amount of pieces of food remaining is different. After the 4,000 men ate, it says, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. With the 5,000, it was 12 basketfuls left over. And even the Greek word for basket is different. For the first one, it's Kophinos, the feeding of the 5,000. This is a basket that typically a Jewish person would carry a meal in. For the 4,000, they're not Jewish. They don't have a Jewish typical basket. The word is spiros, which is more like a larger basket with handles. The same term used in Acts chapter 9 when they put Paul in a basket to lower him from a window to make his escape here. So all the details here are different. The geography, everything. So what about the 12 and the 7? Now, it is important in Scripture, and we've talked about this before, that we don't get into some kind of mysticism with the numbers, right? We've talked how in John 21, when they caught 153 fish, people have spent all kinds of time guessing what that is, when I think it just means how many fish they caught, right? Typically, numbers are just reports. But what's interesting here is Jesus could have controlled, if he's able to do this miracle, certainly he's able to control the amount of the number of baskets left over. I think that's significant. And also the numbers 12 and 7 appear elsewhere. To the early church, they thought that to the disciples, this mentioned the 12 tribes of Israel and the 7 Gentile nations. Listen to Deuteronomy 7, verse 1. Just a couple verses left here. The Lord your God brings you into land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations. Then Moses lists the 7 Gentile nations. The Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, the Canaanites, you've probably heard of them. The Perizzites, the Gigabites. It's just to see if you're paying attention. Okay, that's 5 so far. The Hivites and the Jebusites. They were in Jerusalem, right? 7 nations larger and stronger than you. Now, what the rabbis taught, and in Jewish tradition, Joshua pushed these 7 nations back across the Jordan River to this place here called Tel Hadar, which means splendid hill. This is at the spot, within a few hundred yards. We don't know exactly where they were, but at the site of the multiplication that fed 4,000 people. So it shows 7 baskets left over in the little picture on the rock there. On that stone in the bottom in Greek, it says 12 thrones, referring to the disciples here and what they're able to accomplish with Jesus. Well, Matthew gives us another clue that the 4,000 here were Gentiles. In Matthew 15:31, it says, they praised the God of Israel. You wouldn't have to add of Israel if they were Jewish, because it would be obvious which God they were praising. But they were Gentiles. They praised the God of Israel. In Acts 13:19, Paul says that God worked through the Israelites. Again, we see these numbers. He overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, the Gentiles, and gave their land to his people, the 12 tribes, as their inheritance. So the 12 baskets and the 7 baskets mean salvation is for everyone. That Jesus, as the bread of life, provides this for all people. First to Jewish people, secondly to Gentiles. And that's exactly what Paul says in Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, Paul says, then for the Gentile. And Jesus does the Jewish feeding first in Mark chapter 6, then the Gentile feeding in Mark chapter 8. And what the disciples learned here is recorded for us in the Gospels so we can experience that provision of Jesus, so we can come to him for salvation. Let's pray. Father, we praise you for the power you have to meet our needs. Help us to have the attitude of Jesus, to take part in his work of compassion. Help us to serve you, knowing that you can